Sundays after Pentecost, as we call them now. But I do want to stay focused this week on that Old Testament reading. Des leaned across to me as the reading was being read and went, "Another feisty woman." That's good. We were listening on Friday. We talked about feisty women as we were gathering for prayers on Friday morning. So yes, we have another couple of feisty women and a gentle husband who's kind of caught in between. So it's an interesting story. Last week, you'll remember, we had readings that featured both in the Old Testament and in the Gospel, featured a number of women who had become widows. Their husbands had died. And in that world, as in many parts of the world still, a woman who'd lost her husband, and especially a woman who was supporting young children, would be particularly vulnerable. And that's why when we look up in the Old Testament, we're looking for the instructions God gives his people about compassionate community. The widows and the orphans are almost always listed first. The most vulnerable in an ancient world. And it wasn't that long ago that was true in our world also. When my father died when I was 15 and my mother was 4 months pregnant, age 34, she had a widow's pension. It wasn't much, but she had support. But when her father died, when my mother was 5 or 6, my grandmother had no pension. There was no such thing in the late 1930s in Australia. Some of you will know people who are old enough to remember that. See how carefully I phrased those words? So, last week we had Naomi, we had Orpah, we had Ruth, and of course we had the lady I call Penny, the anonymous widow who dropped the coins into the collection box outside the temple. Vulnerable people who nonetheless had agency, because in some way or other they were people who took control of their future by drawing on their faith. Today we have another kind of vulnerable woman, as the Old Testament reading features the rivalry between two wives, one of whom was the mother of several children, while her rival was unable to have any children. You know how the story's going to end, don't we? It's one of those kind of stories. To use a modern catchphrase, it was a bit complicated. Some of us, perhaps most of us, come from families that are a bit complicated at times. For sure, I do. I've been told by the woman who's now my wife, Eve, who some of you know, when we were telling each other about our families and so on when we first met, when she heard my story of my family, she just shook her head and said, "If you gave the script of that family to a film producer, they wouldn't accept it. They'd say it's too far-fetched, that nobody has a family like that." Well, I do, and maybe some of you do as well. Because life can sometimes be complicated, and families are often far from picture-perfect situations. And each of us are complex people as well, even church families. It's a stark reminder when we look at the data for domestic and family violence, and we see that the rates of abuse within families is just as high amongst church-going families as it is in the general community. You'd think we might be doing a little bit better, but we're not. Interesting, more than interesting. It's a reminder that stuff is complicated and that people will try to control and abuse others in all kinds of circumstances. So last week, we had the story of Ruth and Naomi. It was set in Bethlehem, Christmas bells starting to ring, in the fields of Ephratah. echoes of Christmas were reaching across the lectionary, since Ruth was not only identified by the end of the story as the future great-grandmother of King David, but of course in the Gospel of Matthew, Ruth becomes a direct ancestor of Jesus. So, complex and interesting story, and one complicated family story indeed. And if we're looking for complicated stories, try the Christmas story, the story of Jesus' own family. But this week we have the two rival women, Hannah, which is just Anna in English, and Penina, both of whom were married to a guy from Ramah who was called Elkanah. Now there are lots of families like that in the Old Testament. Indeed, King Solomon, described in the Bible as the wisest man ever to live, had 700 wives and 300 concubines. You can do the maths. I can see you doing the maths already. I can see you're trying to work out the sleeping roster. What's your name again, dear? I haven't seen you for 3 years. Yeah. Hello. All right. Obviously, Solomon is not a model for us to practice, okay, to follow and to emulate. But the point is, in that culture, and our religion and our faith is always wrapped up in our culture, a wealthy and powerful man was expected to collect women, beautiful ones, young ones. It would never happen in our world, would it? We can't think of one rich and powerful man who's had quite a collection of women over the years. It's just not part of our experience, I'm sure. We can see the dynamic. Such families were complicated, as we often see in the biblical narrative. Elkanah himself comes across as a caring and compassionate husband, a decent guy, even if Hannah has to share her husband with that other woman. And that other woman, who was perhaps younger, since Hannah is named first, was cruel, and Hannah found her life was both complicated and bitter. We all know stories like that. Some of us may have families like that. And the cruel control games can be played by men just as much as by women. And they can also be played between the generations, up and down, from older folk to younger folk, and from younger folk abusing older folk. And yes, as I mentioned, it's no different in church families. And there's the tragedy. So as the story unfolds, this nasty little narrative is resolved, of course, when Hannah does eventually have a child, Samuel, who she promptly donates to the elderly priest of the temple. Not something to emulate. I do not want your toddlers being donated to the parish of Ipswich. Thank you very much. Okay. It's what we would call another complication. But not to worry. In the story, God gives Hannah 2 more sons as well as 2 daughters to make up for the one she's abandoned by donating him to the temple. Complicated. I wonder how Samuel felt about his mum, the absent one. Interesting. She bought him a nice new shirt once a year when they came to the temple, so I guess all was good. Which of course means this family was Church of England because they only came to the temple once a year. It's definitely a complicated story, but as these kinds of stories tend to do in fairy tales and Bibles, it all ends well. As does the book of Job, you might remember. But a happy ending does not take away the pain and the abuse from the middle of the story. Not then, and not now. So we finished that reading by saying, "Hear the word of the Lord." And we all said, "Thanks be to God." What are we hearing? What is the sacred wisdom of God being offered to us by the Spirit through stories such as this? There are lots of little aha moments, and I suspect you had some of them as the story unfolded. But for me, the wisdom to be found is particularly connected with the raw faithfulness of Hannah. Hannah comes across as a woman who lives with domestic and family violence and who keeps her dignity because she has such a strong faith and she has someone, Elkanah, who believes in her, who cares about her. Elkanah, for his part, emerges as a good character in this complicated story. He supports, protects, and loves Hannah. He even allows her to donate the long-awaited kid back to the temple. Can't you imagine the conversation? What? What are you saying? This baby you've been desperate to have for years and years and years, you're going to give him to that grumpy old priest in the temple who thought you were drunk? That guy? Are you kidding, woman? Do you need help? Perhaps just listen to me and do what I tell you. That's not the way the story goes, although I suspect there may have been conversations like that in the background in their house. Their personal situation was complicated, but they were there for each other, and they were both people who practiced their faith. And as the story goes, their faith did not waver. It didn't make their life any easier, just like snapping your fingers, but their faith gave them the resources to navigate the complications that they faced. In real life, and not just in this archetypal story, their faith may have been a little bit more complicated. We shall never know. But the person who put this collection of stories together, and assembled, in fact, a whole string of material going from Joshua and Judges through Samuel to the end of 2 Kings, has very deliberately chosen this story because Samuel is the hero of those books in the Old Testament. So what we're overhearing this morning is a legend about the birth of the prophet Samuel. And actually the storyteller's not even interested in Hannah. That sounds like the church we know, doesn't it? So, this person who's put this incredible story together, and it goes from Joshua all the way through to the collapse of the city of Jerusalem, and it's attacked by the Babylonians. The person who's put that story together has chosen a song from the, if you like, from the hymn book at the temple to put on Hannah's lips. And that's what we read part of following the first reading this morning. We call it the Song of Hannah. It wasn't a song composed by Hannah. If you read the whole text, it talks about kings and princes, and we haven't even got there yet in the Old Testament story. But the person telling the story imagines Hannah drawing on the spiritual wisdom of other women who have fashioned this song. And that's the song that we read together just before. And it's a song which has remarkable echoes with the Magnificat in the Gospel of Luke. The women of ancient Israel, and not just Hannah, and not just Naomi, and not just Ruth, had come to know that God was with them. God was with the powerless. God was with the vulnerable. The song comes from a later time, but the song speaks the truth that women of all time and all creeds have understood. Yes, life can be complicated. Yes, our faith can give us hope and enable us to survive and even thrive.